you ever dreamed of exploring another world? Could you witness something new? Push boundaries? Or reach for your greatest hope? The experience of every generation is yours. On the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Hello, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to History Undercover. Even as the rubble was being cleared from the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Americans began asking a troubling question. Why did U.S. intelligence agencies ignore warnings of an attack? One longtime CIA operative has come forward with a first-hand account of the agency and its ineffectiveness against terrorism. Our program tells the story of former spy Baer, who urged the CIA to remove Saddam Hussein from power and who spent decades as a frontline soldier in the war on terrorism. Join us as History Undercover presents Tracking Terror, the CIA in the Middle East. September 11th, 2001.
We saw a shadow, it looked like a plane. Next thing we know, it was boom, and the floor started shaking.
Then we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out.
Terrorism hits America. That morning, no one saw it coming.
It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Former CIA case officer Baer says that the signals were there. We just missed them.
We should have known about it. We should have known that there were groups, Muslim groups, that intended to carry out attacks. They attacked the World Trade Center before. They were forming in Europe. We knew they were all over Europe.
For more than 2 decades, until 1997, Baer was in the middle of it. From Beirut to Baghdad, his job had been to recruit foreign spies and to uncover secret information. He had become familiar with international terrorism and how it operated.
I always had this intuition it was going to come to the United States one day. I was hoping that I was wrong all those years. But I knew that terrorism was creeping east to west, and one day it was going to arrive on our shores.
In See No Evil, Baer's memoirs of his years in the CIA, he has written extensively about the agency's problems and weaknesses, factors he believes caused the U.S. to miss signs of terror.
It was an organization after the Cold War looking for a role. We looked at narcotics, sometimes we looked at terrorism, sometimes we looked at economics. It was directionless in the 90s.
Baer believes the CIA was more comfortable spending money on technology like satellites and communications equipment than on agents in the field. This, he says, made us blind to the terrorist plot to attack America on September 11th.
This plot was hatched in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. We essentially have no agents. We did not have people in the mosques in Saudi Arabia.
The complicated relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia's royal family is often cited as one reason why the CIA may have missed signals in the Middle East.
In the mid-70s, we closed down essentially in Saudi Arabia. We stopped collecting information. That's where the threat came from. That's where bin Laden's from. That's where the people in Afghanistan are getting funded from.
Baer was one of the few CIA case officers familiar with the culture and language of the Arab world. But in 1976, when he applied to the CIA almost as a lark, he had no interest in becoming a career officer.
I'm going to go and just take a look around, and it's an experience, and I'll get out and get a real job. I didn't know what a real job was, but I figured one day I'd have to get one.
There was nothing in Baer's background that made him stand out as a candidate for the CIA.
I wanted to be a ski racer. I grew up in Aspen, Colorado for the most part. Went to college, studied political science, foreign service at Georgetown. Went to San Francisco, looking around, the job market was tough. I could either go back to Aspen, become a ski patrolman, drop out or whatever. This is the 70s.
Baer was living in Berkeley when he applied to join the CIA. He wasn't typical agency material.
I don't think I'd be hired today. They're just, they would have screened me out, saying this guy's too risky.
But he'd spent a great deal of time in his teens living and traveling through Europe with his mother. In the mid-1970s, the CIA seemed to be seeking non-traditional candidates.
The CIA didn't care. They were looking for innovative people. People who could live overseas, talk to people, get out, not mind living overseas. I'd lived overseas a long time. I think that's why they hired me.
His career started at a secret training facility operated by the agency.
And then they sent me down to the farm, which is a training area, which they've asked me not to identify. And they basically, day by day, taught us the process of recruiting agents.
Later, the CIA trained Baer on the streets of Washington, D.C., where, practicing with the FBI, he learned how to spy.
When we got into advanced surveillance, we worked against the FBI. And they put their best people on us. It was a game. We'd beat them. Sometimes they'd catch us, sometimes they wouldn't.
Even as a 23-year-old recruit, Baer thought there was a problem with the CIA's attitude toward terrorism.
I said, why aren't they doing terrorism here? We seem to be the main enemy? I said, there was no answer. We just was ignored.
But this was the mid-1970s, during the Cold War. The CIA's main mission was not to keep an eye on terrorists, but to defeat the Soviet Union.
And the CIA was in the front line, and we were going to recruit Soviet spies to tell us what the plans and intentions of the Kremlin were.
His first foreign posting came in the late 1970s in India. It was then known as a Cold War backwater, where case officers could continue to learn their trade with little risk.
I went to Madras, which is at the ends of the world, and there were Soviet diplomats there. I didn't recruit one. If I had, I wouldn't tell you.
There's a lot about his career he still can't tell us, some of his postings and dates, but he does say that it was on the streets of India that he learned how to reinvent himself, where he became a true operative.
I maybe had 1,000 aliases. You never want to introduce yourself in true name to an agent, if you can help it, because he's too much information, and why give it to him?
After 3 years in India, he was accepted into the CIA's Arabic course. Baer was then assigned in the early 1980s to a post in the Middle East. The exact country is still classified information.
I love the Middle East. I spent all my time with Arabs. So people, when I come back to headquarters, they'd laugh at me and they'd say, you sound just like these people.
He cannot give too many specifics about his early days in the Middle East, but he does say he spent much of the decade here, in Beirut, a city once called the Paris of the Middle East. In the early 80s, militias and terrorist groups were fighting a civil war for control of the city, transforming it from an oasis of sophistication into a cauldron of violence and chaos, a hub of war and international terrorism. It was in Beirut that Baer began his education in international terrorism. He didn't know it at the time, but he was on a path that would eventually lead him to believe that Iran was behind most of the terrorism he was witnessing in Beirut. Beirut is situated at the crossroads of the Middle East, and in 1983 the United States had a large presence there, an active embassy and a marine peacekeeping force. That's when America itself became a target.
April 1983, a pickup truck drove through the front door of the embassy with a single driver and exploded. It brought the U.S. Embassy down. It was one of the worst terrorist attacks the United States had ever suffered to date.
63 people were killed, 17 of them Americans. Nearly the entire CIA station was wiped out. Almost 20 years after the explosion, Baer went back to see the site with ABC News correspondent John Miller.
Now this was the U.S. Embassy.
This was the U.S. Embassy. Faced that way. Car bomb came down here, drove in, blew it up, destroyed it, collapsed in the middle. Essentially, the terrorists turned this into a parking lot. Literally turned sovereign U.S. territory into a parking lot.
In April 1983, at the time of the explosion, there were no leads, no clues. The bombing looked like it would remain unsolved.
It was absolutely devastating that so many people should die, that we didn't know who did it, we had no foreknowledge. We didn't even know who the groups were. It was another black hole.
6 months later, unknown terrorists once again hit Americans in Beirut. 2 suicide bombers drove trucks into the barracks of the U.S. Marine and French peacekeeping forces, killing 299 people. Baer could not stop thinking about the bombings.
I remained fascinated about the embassy bombing. I thought it was the key to a lot of terrorism. And it slowly became an obsession with me.
Baer's obsession with the Marine and embassy bombings was now driving his career. He would not rest until he found those responsible. In the 1980s, Beirut was just like the Wild West. Gunfire was constant, killings were commonplace. Anything and everything was for sale. Bob Baer looked for information anywhere he could find it, including Beirut's shady bars and discos, which served as home to spies, drug dealers, and arms merchants. Years later, he returned to one of his old haunts with John Miller.
It was a bar like this that I'd meet agents, come in, sit down, and order a drink and start talking. Because everybody was involved in some sort of conspiracy. CIA conspiracy, there just was another one, the arms dealers. You'd go to a bar like this, there'd be Colombian narcotics dealers, arms dealers from Russia. There would be, you could find anybody there.
What could you buy in a bar?
In a bar, you could buy anything from a Kalashnikov to a kilo of heroin.
Could you buy a bomb?
You could buy a bomb. There's a place down the street where they made suitcase bombs. I once bought a light anti-tank weapon.
In the aftermath of the 1983 Beirut bombings of the American Embassy and the Marine barracks, the CIA put terrorism on its priority list, starting a Counterterrorism Center. Veteran CIA case officer Dewey Claridge was in charge, and he wanted Baer to be a part of this new war on terrorism.
The reason I asked for Baer was, came down to a couple, really. One, he spoke Arabic, which was fairly rare in those days. Number two is he had a reputation for being an innovative and inventive officer.
The CIA formed the center, hoping that creative officers like Baer would help the CIA take a more aggressive stand against terrorism.
The primary purpose was to take the agency, and hopefully the U.S. government as a whole, from a basically defensive attitude towards terrorism to the offensive attitude, and that is going for the terrorists.
After most of the CIA staff in Beirut was wiped out in the embassy bombing, Baer was one of the few remaining CIA case officers who knew the city. He worked hard to solve the embassy attack.
We didn't know who the suicide bomber was. We weren't really quite sure where the truck came from, who owned it. We didn't know where the explosives, we didn't know who ordered it, we didn't know where the truck was prepared, nothing.
In the mid-1980s, there were many similar mysteries in Beirut, unsolved bombings and assassinations. The city's streets were chaotic and dangerous.
It was hell. It was open season on everybody. Every political interest group decided to exploit every fear, every bit of anger it could in the region.
The conditions of our captivity are very bad.
And in the 1980s, terrorists in Beirut had come up with something new, kidnapping Americans. The first was David Dodge, acting president of the American University of Beirut. He was kidnapped in July 1982 and bundled off to Tehran by terrorists affiliated with Iran. By the time he was released a year later, no Westerner was safe.
Job number one for me was to find the hostages. And once they were found, is prepare a rescue to get them out. There were dozens of Americans being held hostage.
Resolving the hostage problem in Lebanon was one of the greatest, problems we all faced.
We ask that our government take action for our release quickly.
In an incident especially embarrassing to the CIA, its own Beirut station chief, Bill Buckley, was kidnapped off a city street in July 1984. To avoid becoming a hostage himself, Baer did his best to blend in to the Beirut street scene.
The last thing you wanted to do was be a foreigner driving around in a Range Rover or an armored car, because that made you important. The way the mentality worked, they looked at me and they said, look at this guy, he's in Levi's, he's driving an old beat-up car. I mean, he has to be at the bottom of the food chain. He's not worth assassinating. He's not worth kidnapping.
Hoping to blend in even more, Baer showed his ingenuity by doing the unexpected. He became a Beirut taxi driver.
And when you picked up a fare, didn't they notice at some point that you were American?
I still had an accent. I told them I was American, and they flipped out. They said, are you of Lebanese origin? I said, no, I'm just a regular American.
I had to think you were crazy being here in the middle of a civil war driving a taxi.
That's it. I joke with me. We have a lot of unemployment in the United States, and this is just temporary.
From behind the wheel of his cab, Baer was slowly and carefully gathering information. Already doing the unexpected, he now decided to do the unthinkable. He took a trip into Lebanon's heart of darkness, the notorious Bekaa Valley, lying between Beirut and the Syrian border. In this one small region, almost every known terrorist group in the Middle East had its own outpost. All were violently anti-American, including one of the most dangerous in the world, the Iranian-backed Hezbollah, the group that had kidnapped Bill Buckley.
It was the descent into hell, because the entire Bekaa Valley is a lawless, it's Indian country. Blown up buildings. There was pictures of the mosque in Jerusalem breaking through an American flag. I read Farsi and I read Arabic, and there were banners across the street, "Death to America."
Any American foolhardy enough to venture into the Bekaa Valley was a potential kidnapping victim, or worse. But for a CIA officer, the area was an intelligence gold mine.
But what it was by the middle of the 80s for sure was a depot for weapons coming in from Iran through Damascus to support the various groups in Lebanon that the Iranians were supporting.
Baer had to see it. He had a feeling about the place, a hunch, he explained to ABC correspondent Miller, who accompanied him on his return to the Bekaa Valley town of Baalbek in 2001.
It was, like I like to call it, it was the bottom circle of hell when it comes to terrorism. And the CIA never sent anybody up here, or no one would ever agree to come. It was too dangerous. But I just had this obsession with seeing what it was like, and I just had a hunch that if you knew what was on the ground here, it was the start of piecing together what happened to the hostages and where the terrorism starts. And this was it.
When Baer had taken that dangerous journey to Baalbek in the 1980s, he had concealed his identity, pretending to be an eccentric Belgian archaeologist interested in seeing the historic ruins. He didn't know it at the time, but Baer later discovered that he had been just yards away from the CIA's kidnapped Beirut station chief, Bill Buckley, who would never make it out alive.
At one point, the guides took me up by that road below, and you'll see a building there, a white building, and there's one above it.
Oh yeah.
They had armed guards, and they had the windows covered. I didn't think anything about it. But later, from very good intelligence sources, we found out that's where the hostages were. So I was basically a football field away from Bill Buckley and the other hostages.
In his travels throughout Lebanon, Baer developed his own network of agents, and he began to unravel the mystery of the embassy bombing. Years later, Baer still cannot reveal the identity of his most important agent there, but credits him with finding out the details of the attack.
The agent was very smart. I could send him into the mosque. He elicited information. He told me the name. I had other sources check out the name of the suicide bomber, and it looked like the right guy.
By 1988, Baer's sources had discovered just who was behind the embassy bombing and more.
Iran was behind the bombing, the government of Iran.
And the bombing of the Marine barracks?
The government of Iran.
And the taking of the hostages?
Iran, absolutely. Look, in 1979, Iran declared war on the United States, an unofficial war. All these acts, right through Kobar, were all authorized by the central government in Tehran.
By the late 1980s, Baer had reliable information that America's #1 enemy in the Middle East was Iran, and that it was responsible for funding the terrorist groups behind the embassy and Marine barracks bombings. But CIA headquarters, according to Baer, didn't seem to care.
I started to write it up in what's called an intelligence report, which is disseminated throughout Washington. And Washington came back and said that they would not disseminate the report, that thank you for the information, but it's historical information. It's historical at this point.
You'd have CIA people would find out information. It'd be passed on, and then the information would be ignored. And this happened again and again.
But as Baer continued to run his network of agents, he found even more information linking Iran to terrorism, like the 1986 hijacking of an American airliner, TWA Flight 847.
We knew the people that hijacked TWA 847. We were 100% certain. We knew their names. We knew where they lived.
The mastermind behind the hijacking was a shadowy terrorist, Imad Mughniya. As head of a terror group linked to Iran, Mughniya had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. Baer told Miller that Mughniya's whereabouts had been known by one of his contacts who couldn't understand why the CIA just didn't kill Mughniya.
He had his own plan. He said, in Beirut, we solve these problems, car bombs, assassinations, whatever.
None of this arrest stuff?
None of it. He didn't understand it. He didn't know what I was talking about. What do you mean arrest him? Why would you arrest somebody and take him to a court? What are you talking about? The guy's either your enemy or it's not. If he's not, you know, if he's your enemy, this is the way we take care of it.
When you look back from September 11th to a decision like that, where you walked away from a plan because it would have required killing the guy, which would have been against all the rules, do you think the rules should have been changed then?
You keep on asking me the hard questions. that is a hard question.
Before 9/11, according to Baer, Washington had little appetite for dealing with terrorism or its state sponsors, like Iran.
My opinion is, I wasn't in the White House though, people considered it a small price to pay to maintain the status quo in the Gulf. But if you go to war with Iran, a conventional war, it's going to upset the Gulf. It's our supply of oil.
At the time, Baer could not understand Washington's reluctance to get involved.
Once we'd assembled the information, why didn't we do something about it? Iran had declared war on the United States. The way to stop terrorism is stop it right away. By letting it go on for 20 years, we ended up with September 11th.
In the 1980s, Baer could not get Washington to listen to him while he fought terrorism in Lebanon. He had no way of knowing it at the time, but history would repeat itself. The next time, it would be Iraq in the 1990s. CIA case officer Bob Baer traveled the world fighting terrorism in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The CIA never leaves its agents in one place too long, and in 1988 he was transferred from Beirut to Paris. He also spent time in the former Soviet republics, but the details of these postings are cloudy, still classified. He can talk about his return to the Middle East, though. It was in 1995, and he was assigned to Iraq. It was the perfect moment, he says, to take out Saddam Hussein.
At the time, Iraq was broke, flat broke. The army, there were soldiers deserting, mess. The family was fighting. There was shootings all over Iraq. That was the time to get rid of them. We had a window then. It was absolutely a crucial window for the Iraqi opposition to get rid of Saddam Hussein. That was the time to do it without an invasion.
Baer was operating in rebel-held northern Iraq, serving as a liaison between the CIA and Iraqi opposition forces, training for an eventual insurrection against Saddam.
No one else wanted to go, so I led a 5-person team into the north in January 1995. We walked in from Turkey, we picked up some old cars, and we drove around, and we were basically in civilian clothes.
In the 1990s, northern Iraq, like the Bekaa Valley 10 years before, was an extremely dangerous place for an American. Even though the rebels controlled it, Saddam's spies and agents were operating there, and it was regularly shelled by Iraqi artillery.
I got moved from house from night to night. We lived in Kurdish houses, slept in cars outside. Because as the situation gets dangerous, the more you move, the safer you are.
After working with the opposition, Baer came to believe that Saddam's regime could be toppled by the dissident Iraqis themselves, with just a little help from their American friends.
We did not need the U.S. Air Force to get rid of Saddam Hussein in 1994. The Iraqis, with some encouragement, if we'd given them some backbone, could have done it.
Baer quickly built a relationship with a leader of one of the main dissident groups, a man who had opposed Saddam for more than 20 years, Ahmed Chalabi. For Chalabi, the presence of a CIA case officer in northern Iraq was encouraging, since almost immediately after the Gulf War, the U.S. seemed to have lost interest in Iraq.
There was a change. It had become clear that the United States was telling us that they were pursuing an active policy to get rid of Saddam.
And Ahmed Chalabi had a plan to get rid of Saddam, just what he and Baer thought Washington wanted. The rebel leader worked closely with his CIA liaison.
Throw a match in and it'll go up and Saddam's gone. And anybody's better than Saddam, because Saddam, Chalabi said, is going to go to war again. He's going to invade Saudi Arabia.
But with Bob, I had several meetings with him on a daily basis, and he exchanged notes with me many times during the day.
We both knew that this was a crucial period, that we had to move Washington forward, or basically have Washington say, no, we want to leave Saddam in power.
Chalabi's plan to overthrow Saddam Hussein was two-pronged. One, an uprising by Iraqi troops inside the country, and two, an invasion by opposition forces from northern Iraq. Following CIA protocol, Baer sent a report to Washington outlining Chalabi's plan in January of 1995.
So I wrote up a message saying that Ahmed Chalabi intends to launch an insurrection to overthrow Saddam Hussein at 10 o'clock on the 4th of March. It couldn't be any clearer. Washington didn't answer, not a word. I was ready for anything. You know, if they would have said, you guys are out of your mind, come home, stop, do it later, don't do it at all, this isn't our policy, anything. We just wanted clear guidance. That's all we wanted.
Washington did not respond, Baer says, but he and Chalabi continued working on the plan. During the first 2 months of 1995, rebel forces were trained and political alliances were strengthened. Finally, just days before the planned March insurrection, Washington did respond, but not in the way either man had expected. The final word came from the White House, not the CIA, a cable from the Clinton administration's National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake.
Bob walks in with red eyes, clearly hadn't slept the night before, and walks in with very sad demeanor, disappointed, and says to me, I have to read you this message from Washington.
It says, the action you have planned for this weekend has been totally compromised. And then it said, we believe there's a high risk of failure. Any decision to proceed will be entirely your own.
The insurrection went ahead, but it disintegrated without U.S. support. As a result, the Iraqi opposition lost its faith in the U.S.
The Iraqi people believed the United States was happy to keep Saddam in power. That he was an American agent, that we liked him, that even though he invaded Kuwait, we were happy with him.
It was the signal that Saddam was waiting for, that the United States neither has the determination nor the staying power to confront him.
Baer says that the Anthony Lake cable showed that Washington politics determined what the CIA did in the field.
It was a White House policy. They didn't care what went on in Iraq. All we cared about was keeping Saddam in his box. Make sure he didn't invade Kuwait again, didn't invade Saudi Arabia, maintain the status quo. As long as the price of oil was $10, $12 a barrel at the time, it's good for the American economy. Saddam wasn't bothering anybody.
If Baer was surprised by Washington's response to the Iraqi rebels, he would be shocked at what happened next. He was about to find out that the CIA wasn't after Saddam Hussein at all. It was after him.
The attack here at Vienna's airport began at the same time as the one in Rome. 3 armed men ran into the east door of the airport.
Terrorism is dirty warfare. It's clandestine, often savage. Information is critical in waging a war against an often unseen and anonymous enemy, but it is difficult to obtain. It's a task made even more complicated for American agents and intelligence operatives who are required to fight a dirty war with clean hands.
So we couldn't talk to terrorists who had killed people. We were terminating agents who had been involved in terrorism, even though they were reporting to us and we had them more or less under control.
The Mother Teresas of this world don't know when terrorist operations are going down. It's the people who have blood on their hands who do.
According to former CIA case officer Dwayne Claridge, it's an issue the agency has been struggling with for some time.
The nervousness of CIA dealing with people with blood on their hands has been a problem, and I know for a fact since at least 1977.
The CIA started grappling with the issue in the early 1970s when Congress learned of CIA assassination attempts targeting Fidel Castro and other abuses of power. In 1976, President Gerald Ford signed an executive order, still in effect, that made the assassination of a foreign leader illegal.
It's made very clear to us as CIA case officers, we don't assassinate people or kill people.
By executive order, even obvious enemies like Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein are protected against an American assassination. Only the president can authorize an exception.
And if I were a manager today in CIA and a junior officer came to me and says, I could get this guy, I'd say, don't do it, because you're going to end up in jail.
To many intelligence operatives, there's a fine line between assassination and military action.
Dropping a 2,000-pound bomb on somebody's head, to me, is not a lot different than hiring somebody to pick up a silenced pistol and blow his head away.
Whether or not there is a moral distinction, Baer faced the problem head-on in Iraq. An Iraqi defector, a former army general, came to him in 1995 and said he wanted to ambush Saddam Hussein.
We're going to pull trucks in front of Saddam's convoy. We'll know when he's going to cross the bridge. We'll pull trucks in front of his convoy and behind it, so they're blocked in. It was a very traditional, classic ambush.
Again, Baer says he notified Washington.
When I got no answer, I went to the general on my own and I said, forget the ambush on the bridge. The CIA, the United States, is prohibited from assassinating foreign leaders or anybody. This sounds too much like an assassination.
But the White House believed that he might have been involved in a plot to assassinate Saddam. Just before the Iraqi opposition's March 1995 insurrection against Saddam Hussein, Baer and his team were called back to Washington immediately. Baer tried to argue.
I said, well, I need to stay here through this fighting because it's successful, and if I leave, it'll be a bad sign. Because for better or worse, I'm associated with this plan. And they said, no, you are in trouble. I said, trouble for what? And we can't tell you.
At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, several days later, Baer found out what the hurry was.
There's 2 FBI agents waiting for me on the 7th floor of the CIA. They show me their credentials, read me my rights, and saying, you are being investigated under murder for hire statutes.
It wasn't until that moment that Baer realized he was being investigated for authorizing the murder of Saddam Hussein.
We just fought a war with this man. He's a murderer. He's going to invade Saudi Arabia one day, or Kuwait. And the only thing that the White House cares about is putting 5 CIA officers in jail. It's insane. For killing our enemy. Or trying to, even if it were true, but it's not true, I assure you.
He reported into his bosses. His bosses knew what he was doing. And it seemed to me that what you have here is a split policy. Somebody at the White House not understanding what the ongoing orders were to the CIA.
They accused me of privately attempting to murder Saddam Hussein. It was based on some silly rumor. It was picked up by the White House. And what I didn't know at the time was the penalty is capital punishment.
After an investigation that included repeated polygraph tests, he was cleared of the charges, finally. But for Baer, it was a turning point.
My career was over at that point, because people always remember I was the guy that was investigated for attempting to murder Saddam. You know, it's not somebody you want to send to a nice cocktail party or send to work down at the White House.
After the investigation, he was given a desk job in Washington, D.C. His career as a CIA case officer was coming to a close.
I knew it was time to leave the CIA when I got on the computer and started looking through the amount of intelligence coming around the world. There wasn't anything there. And I said, you know, it's closed down.
Baer feels not only that the CIA became too cautious in waging a war against terrorism, but also that the agency, in effect, shut down. Both factors, he says, would contribute to the agency's greatest intelligence failure ever. When terror hit America on September 11, 2001, Bob Baer, like many other Americans, was shocked and outraged. But he wasn't as surprised as the rest of us.
Oh my God, this is so terrible.
His book, in part, is about how an overly confident America shut down its intelligence apparatus and missed important signals.
We were feeling good about ourselves. We weren't doing any direct harm to anybody. And we basically closed down. The FBI and the CIA closed down in the 90s.
The first clue that terrorism was coming to America was overlooked by everybody, including Bob Baer. It seemed to be an incident of only local significance. In hindsight, it smacks of the violence of Beirut. It was the 1990 murder of the radical leader of the anti-Arab Jewish Defense League, Meir Kahane, by an Arab gunman in New York City.
Everybody was nothing with love for Kahane, for love and warmth, and all of a sudden this happened and another murder in New York City.
What we, the local prosecutors, thought we had was a simple murder case. Was an Arab killed a prominent Jew. And we had witnesses and we had the gun and we tried it as a simple murder case.
The gunman was Saeed Nosser, and after his arrest, police recovered boxes of pictures, tape recordings, and documents in Arabic from his home. The information wasn't translated until years later.
It was only after February of 1993 that we did translate it. And that this was information that, when you now look back in retrospect, you see writings about how to build bombs, and in literally how to build the bomb that was used in the First World Trade Center.
According to Baer and other intelligence experts, the World Trade Center attack in 1993 should have told everyone that America was being targeted. But it didn't. 6 people were killed and there were numerous injuries, but the towers remained standing. To many in government, the terrorist strike was judged a failure, and was written off as a fluke.
They were trying to kill 25,000, but they weren't as successful as they had wanted to be. It was also a group that wasn't particularly sophisticated at the time.
Michael Cherkasky was head of investigations for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in the early 1990s.
When you look back, it was the fatal flaw, the hubris, the arrogance that didn't allow us to understand what we were really up against.
We did not take terrorism seriously. It was ignored. And that's the simple fact.
Even after the first World Trade Center bombing, terrorism was still viewed as a foreign problem.
You know, if bombs go off in Paris, well, that's a French problem. You know, those things happen in France. And if you happen to be in the wrong place, well, you shouldn't travel overseas.
But overseas, terrorists were racking up American targets. The 1996 explosion of the Khobar apartment towers on a U.S. military base in Saudi Arabia, 19 dead. The 1998 bombing of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, 224 dead. The 2000 attack on the USS Cole, 17 dead. And we now know that Osama bin Laden was connected to all of them.
Osama bin Laden tried to blow up the World Trade Center once. We knew who it was. We knew who was responsible. And he didn't succeed. And the fact that he'd go back to the original target again should have come as no surprise to anybody. I can tell you it didn't come as a surprise to FBI profilers.
Critics of the CIA feel that the agency had become too cautious, afraid of acting boldly. Requests for operations were turned down.
It's much easier to say no. And if you push too hard, you were considered a cowboy. I was considered a cowboy. No question about it. I was always pushing the envelope.
A cowboy is the guy who's got to risk his neck, has got to put his neck on the line to get the information. He's good for working the sources and methods. He's the guy who gets the information coming in.
But the CIA chose to invest in technology over operatives. Technology was seen as a safe alternative. Computers couldn't make mistakes in the field.
The CIA came suburbanized. We were interested in technology. .coms, you know, they invest in some .com company or whatever it is in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago. Technology, economics, internet, it was the fad.
But technology, satellite imagery, and computers, and a yearly intelligence budget of $30 billion did not stop terrorists from striking a tragic blow on 9/11.
We wasted $30 billion as far as I'm concerned. We should have known. Not necessarily the exact plot, but we should have known they're coming.
Soon after 9/11, CIA lapses were closely scrutinized. As a result, procedures are now in place to provide for better information sharing between the CIA and FBI, and a federal agency for Homeland Security has been created.
At some point, the public's going to say, we went to war to get Osama bin Laden. Why can't we find him? We spend more than $30 billion a year on intelligence, now God knows how much since the 9/11 attacks, and we can't find him. Why is that?
Baer feels that we still aren't getting it right, even after 9/11, and that it's going to take a lot more for America to really fight terrorism.
I think it's going to probably take one or two more attacks, maybe not the same magnitude. There's going to be a wake-up call. There's going to be a patent that's going to come along and say, all right, let's cut out the nonsense. Let's get back to recruiting agents. Let's go back, get people on the ground, send them to Europe, send them to the Middle East, find out what's going on in the Gulf, find out what's going on in Iran, and forget the politics.
Since 9/11, the CIA has stepped up its recruiting, hoping to rely less on computers and satellites, more on real live spies. In the first year after the terror attacks, the agency processed more than 100,000 applications, double the usual number. For the History Channel, I'm Arthur Kent. Thanks for watching.